Sack Russell T Davies.
Hey everyone, welcome back to what will be parts 14 and 15 combined of this series where we rank every season of New Who, that is Doctor Who, since the 2005 revival. Of course, we've already ranked seasons 1 through 13, each episode in those seasons, as well as the 60th anniversary specials in a video that we called Ranking Season 13.5. But I figured now that officially we know, spoilers, major spoilers ahead, that we are now out of the Ncuti Gatwa era of Doctor Who, I figured it was appropriate to combine the last two seasons into one video since, of course, we did not do a video yet for Season 14, and now that we are through Season 15 and Ncuti Gatwa is gone, it would be nice to rank them all together in a single video. And it's not difficult to do so, given that there are only 17 episodes. So, with that being said, if you haven't watched all of these episodes, like I said, there will be major spoilers ahead for especially what has just happened this last weekend with the new season finale of Doctor Who, ahead of who we now know is the 16th Doctor, as well as just kind of some general thoughts about the series that going forward. So if you've never seen Doctor Who, if these are things that you do not want spoiled, be aware of that. And just remember, these are my opinions. You're more than welcome to have your own opinions. Feel free to drop them in the comments below, and we will have some discussions about them as well. But first 13 and a half parts are available in the playlist in their own videos, but this is specifically seasons 14 and 15 for Ncuti Gatwa's 15th Doctor. So I'm going to switch my screen here, and we are on a standard S through F tier list. And how we do things, we don't go in episode order. We go kind of in order from what I think is the worst to the best, and we're going to start down at the bottom. Now, I have seen all of these episodes now twice, and I still think that in last place on our list, I am going to place Wish World. Now, I want to preface Wish World by kind of spoiling my thoughts on the penultimate episode of Series 14, which is The Legend of Ruby Sunday. Now, I think there's issues with both episodes. The thing that I will give credit to with The Legend of Ruby Sunday is that it is set up for the finale, but it gives us more substance than Wish World. With Wish World, there's kind of a two-sided, almost like, it doesn't quite make sense when I explain it, but it feels like there's too much going on and too much exposition explaining what's going on. But at the same time, the things that we want to know about and have questions about are not explained to us. And saying that, I want to explain first and foremost and put it out there that this episode, in combination with its sequel episode, as well as the finale two-parter for season 14 or series 14, I'm not going to base my love or dislike of one episode based on how I feel about the other half of the episode. That being said, everything we know about Wish World is seen as a setup, and it's not done very well. And that's kind of been the general consensus about Wish World. The set design of the Bone Palace, as you can't quite see it in this picture here, is gorgeous. And I've heard a lot of praise being given to the performance of the Rani as well as Mrs. Flood, and I don't have any issues with that. But everything else about Wish World is a complete mess of an episode. We have way too many plot points all over the place. And this is where I want to caveat what I said about my feelings toward the follow-up episode, because of the fact that we don't really get any payoffs to many of these plot threads. First of all, we have the God of Wishes with Desiderium. We have Conrad and all of his wish world and that sort of thing, and the things that he desires and the redemption that we get for him later on coming up. We have the two separate Ronnies who, that doesn't really go anywhere either. Not the way we expected or wanted, or it feels like they inserted two Time Lords or two Time Ladies into the story for really no reason, expecting us to get excited. They spoiled the reveal in the previous episode. We'll talk about the previous episode eventually on this list. We have these bone creatures that do show up in the finale, but exist. We have kind of this alternate world that is never explicitly explained. It's a lot of setup without making us feel good about the setup. Going into the finale of Series 15, it felt like Wish World started us into it, but didn't leave us satisfied with a potential upcoming sequel the way that The Legend of Ruby Sunday did. And there are issues with The Legend of Ruby Sunday, and we'll talk about that coming up soon. But Wishworld just kind of exists, and it's a mess, and there's so many plot lines going on. None of them really get resolved in a satisfying way in the following episode. And we'll talk about the following episode very, very soon. But with Wishworld specifically, it's just a mess of an episode with so much going on. There is so little I actually like about this episode. I like the performance of the Ronnie. I really genuinely do. And I love the fact that they included Theres as, if you guys are unfamiliar, Theres is a Doctor Who YouTuber who is in a wheelchair and was part of the kind of cameo cast for the, for the life of me, I cannot remember the name of their group, but the homeless encampment in this episode plays a part in the cameo. It was awesome to see Thomas in that cameo role. Very happy for him. That being said, there's not a lot to like about Wishworld. It's a mess of an episode. It doesn't really set anything up consistently, and the cliffhanger that it leaves us on about Omega showing up is never really paid off in a satisfying way either. Like I said, at least with Legend of Ruby Sunday, we got the Sutekh reveal, and it felt like Sutekh was this big thing. We don't feel that with Omega in Wishworld. It's just a mess, and it really is disappointing, especially going into the finale, and we'll talk about the finale in a second, but I think easily F tier Wishworld, easily the weakest episode, the poorest episode, poorest executed, poorest conceptualized episode in Ncuti Gatwa's entire era, but it's the only episode I have an F tier. So we're going to move up to D tier then, and the next episode that I have on my list as we go up here is going to be The Reality War. So the sequel to Wishworld, The Reality War, let's find it here on our list. The Reality War, it just came out, and so thoughts are kind of fresh. There's a lot I hate about this episode too. But what I think The Reality War has over Wishworld, despite the fact that a lot of what was set up or kind of predestined in Wishworld didn't have a satisfying conclusion, I thought that the emotional beats for a lot of what existed in this episode were handled well. And most of that is down to the acting. I think, as positive as I will be about Murray Gold's score for Series 15 specifically, I think the music was edited into this episode very, very poorly. And most of the emotional beats are because of the acting, which is excellent. Verda Sethu is fantastic. Ncuti Gatwa was fantastic. It was awesome to see the hotel, the Time Hotel from Joy to the World, Anita come back. That was fun. But there were a lot of plot threads that were either mishandled or didn't really go anywhere, or just completely were not even addressed to begin with. Susan didn't appear in this episode. What was that about? We'll talk about that when we get to Interstellar Song Contest, because it's another loose plot thread that is, could it ever be picked up? I don't know. What I do like about this episode, apart from those things, is we've talked a lot about bi-generation in this kind of era, and the positives and negatives of that, and I think there's a lot more negatives than positives. But what I liked about this episode is the way that it presented bi-generation as an evolutionary tool to fix the Time Lords, because the Time Lords, as we've never really been presented before, are apparently sterile because of something that happened on Gallifrey, and bi-generation is almost an asexual way to fix that for the Time Lords and create more Time Lords. And that's kind of an interesting thought and something I never would have thought of, and I actually kind of like the way it was presented here. But the way that the Ronnies were handled, the way that the Ronnie is simply just eaten by Omega, and then Omega is defeated by a giant laser and only appears for like a split second and looks like a giant mummified corpse, and it, like, that's supposed to be our big bad? Or is it the Bone Beasts? Or, like, it doesn't feel like this episode has a real villain. I thought the last third of this episode was decent. but how it handles Poppy, how it handles Ruby's story, I thought was somewhat unsatisfying. And then, of course, you get the regeneration, and I have a lot of issues with this episode. But I think it has more positive than Wish World, which is why it sits in D tier. But I'm really not excited for the future of the show based on the way this episode was handled, based on the way that it was marketed, with Billie Piper as the 16th Doctor. I love Billie Piper. I love the character of Rose. I love Billie Piper as a performer and an actress. What the heck are they doing with this TV show? Like, the red flags were up with David Tennant. What the heck are they doing with this TV show? It genuinely feels like the train has completely gone off the rails. I love this show to death. I think Ncuti Gatwa was a fantastic Doctor. I was very positive about these two series in general. But if you were trying to land the plane became Malaysia Flight 370 and just disappeared off the face of the planet. Like, what is happening to this TV show? These 2 episodes are indicative of that. That's not even to mention Susan Twist just appears for no reason. Never really addressed, apart from the fact that apparently the TARDIS saved Susan Twist from being a harbinger of Sutekh in the previous season finale. That doesn't really go anywhere. Like I said, Susan never appears in this episode. Different Susan. Susan Foreman never appears in this episode. We talked about Poppy. We talked about Billie Piper. Jodie Whittaker shows up, which is nice. I was not expecting Jodie Whittaker to show up. There's a cameo from Matt Smith, but it's from a previous episode. It doesn't really count. But Jodie Whittaker shows up for a completely new scene. That was kind of nice to see. These 2 episodes are a mess. I've explained why I like this one over Wish World. I think they're both not great episodes. Let's move up. Let's move on. This is kind of recency anti-bias showing up in me, but like I said, I've watched these episodes twice, and I'm kind of taking the consensus that is coming out from the rest of the general Doctor Who universe here. Let's move up to Lucky Day. Lucky Day, apart from these finales, I think is the weakest episode in this season for a variety of reasons. Not because it's a companion light episode, because we'll talk about a Doctor Light episode, and we'll talk about another Doctor Light episode coming up at the end of this video that is actually very, very good. And the reason that this one is not good, in my opinion, is the characters are uncompelling. The characters are unconvincing. The threat never really feels whole. It feels like a very short, rushed episode. I think, as much as I like Millie Gibson, I really do, I think Ruby's character is underdeveloped, and every time that she is on her own, her character somehow gets less developed than it needs to be with a whole episode. She has 2 of them, and both of them feel super, super underdeveloped for what they need to for her character. I don't love the way that Unit is portrayed in this episode. I don't like the way that it kind of plays on the whole Andrew Tate thing and the whole conspiracy vibe and almost Alex Jones-ish. I don't like Conrad as a character. I don't think he's a very convincing villain. I don't think he's very threatening in any of his appearances. I don't have much to say on Lucky Day. I just don't like the atmosphere of the episode. I don't like the acting of the episode. I don't like the character motivations of this episode. There's a lot I don't like about it. Why is it in D tier above F tier? Because I think there's a little more substance than there is in Wish World, and I think that as a whole, the story is more cohesive than the reality war. But I still don't like it as an episode, and that's why it sits where it does there in D tier. Space Babies. Now, Space Babies is an interesting one. Space Babies is one of those that has been wildly considered like one of the worst episodes of the show. I don't necessarily think that's true. And there are a lot of people that like defend it to the hilt. Like DW Fan 91 will defend this episode. I don't think it's a good episode. I don't think it's terrible. I just think it's kind of inconsequential and insubstantive. That being said, what the heck is Poppy doing in this episode? Because it was a huge mystery going into the finales of Series 15 that this character that we had in the previous season's opener is now appearing. And now that we see Poppy as kind of this new, completely new character, like Belinda's child, right? They never explain why Poppy appears in this episode. Do they? Did I miss something? Like, correct me if I'm wrong, but am I missing something completely? Like, why is Poppy in this episode? Why is Poppy the captain of these space babies? It touches on the political atmosphere of abortion versus adoption, and then the whole kind of idea that those who are so anti-abortion don't really look after children once they're born, kind of thing. Something to touch on. It didn't really feel like that went anywhere or said anything or like pushed us in a direction other than this thought is bad. It felt a little shallow in its messaging. The concept is, like I said, inconsequential, insubstantial, which is kind of why it sits in C tier. The one thing that I think detracts against this episode, and it may be different for those of you that have watched Doctor Who kind of in a binge, this episode, if you were there when it came out on Disney Plus at the beginning of Series 14, this episode and the following episode were released at the same time. And so what Space Babies has going against it in that aspect is the fact that it was a season opener in addition to not having room to breathe as its own episode, because most people were then focused on the follow-up episode, which aired at the same time. And so it was already off to a losing start. It never should have been placed as the opening episode of the season. I might do a video in the future of how I would have reordered the episodes of Series 14 to make it flow better. It's just kind of a middle episode. Like, there's nothing I super love about it. There's nothing I super hate about it. There's just a lot going against it. And I think that's why it sits in C tier. So that's where it sits for me. Bottom of C tier for me. Let's then move up to the next episode in my list, which is Empire of Death. So this is the Series 14 finale episode. Now, there's a lot I don't love about Empire of Death, especially how it was set up in Legend of Ruby Sunday. Now, I'm a big fan of Pyramids of Mars. I think it's one of the best episodes from the classic series. I love Sutekh as a villain. I love the performance of the villain. It's the same actor in both installments. It's like 50 years apart. But with Empire of Death, I don't love the way that it kind of sidelines the villain. It sidelines Sutekh. Sutekh kind of becomes this CGI just mess of a character. I don't like the way that it's resolved. I'm not going to say I hate the way that Ruby's mom was this whole kind of inconsequential reveal. I actually kind of like that idea. I just don't like the way that it was handled. I don't like the way that they built it up as much as they did, only for it to be kind of this fake thing. It just didn't really make a lot of sense, especially with the whole like snowing thing and belief thing. And you could tie that into the season finale of Series 14, or Series 15 rather, and talk about the whole mystical aesthetic of this whole Ncuti Gatwa era. But Empire of Death just kind of fumbles the ball that it felt like was built up with Legend of Ruby Sunday. There are still issues with Legend of Ruby Sunday. We'll talk about them in a sec. But I didn't like what it did for Sutekh. I didn't like what it did for... The pacing of the episode was weird. It just felt really empty for most of it. I don't like the way that Sutekh was handled. I didn't like the way that Sutekh looked. I didn't like the redesign. There's a lot not to like about this episode. There's still elements of good TV there, which is why, for me, it sits in C tier as opposed to the series finale of Series 15. But that's kind of all I have to say about it. C tier for me. When you look at Legend of Ruby Sunday as a whole, and what it sets up for a very disappointing finale, I think it's D tier. But on its own, I'm going to put it literally right above Empire of Death. And the reason why is because of the fact that what we talked about with Wish World, where it didn't feel like the plot twist or the plot drop gave us that much substance. To me, as a fan of Pyramid of Mars, it does. because, with the whole Susan triad reveal, us thinking that it's going to be Susan, which she appears in season 15, by the way. What happened to that? Anyways, with Sutek showing up at the end, knowing the line where I think it's Harriet Arbinger says the line where it's like, he is known by many names, and then she starts listing them. Very few times watching Doctor Who have I actually gotten goosebumps watching a show. And for me, the Sutek reveal, as stupid as the scrawl of Susan Technology Sutek was, the reveal that Sutek was the enemy, to me, as a fan of Pyramids of Mars, was awesome. Was really cool. That being said, there isn't a ton of substance left to this episode, especially, like I said, when compared to the after effects of Empire of Death. Because what Empire of Death does is kill the effect of that plot twist, the plot reveal at the end of the episode. And there's not a lot else in this episode besides them being trapped in unit headquarters looking for Ruby's mom. There really isn't much that happens in this episode. On its own, I want to put it in C tier. And like I said, that's how I want to rank these episodes. But in the context of everything else, I want to drop it down to D tier. But to stay consistent, I want to leave it where it is in C tier. Does that make any sense? I hope it makes sense. Let's then move up to, I'm taking a look at my list here, and I believe the next one on my list is the Interstellar Song Contest. Now, this is going to be a contentious entry. Some people really love this episode. Some people really hate this episode. Here's my thoughts on it. I thought this was one of the best produced episodes of Doctor Who ever. It's apparently the most expensive episode of Doctor Who ever produced. I didn't even mind the tie-in to Eurovision. I thought that was a fun element. I liked the general story idea of this episode. The execution of the concept of this episode was so poor. There are very few episodes, so for example, I walked away from The Reality War feeling bad about my favorite TV show. Right? I'm not happy with the place that Doctor Who is in at the moment. Very rarely do I come out of an episode feeling disgusted or just kind of generally gross about an episode. And the biggest thing with this episode is the way that it handles a very, very serious, very, very prominent contemporary topic, that being the conflict between Israel and Palestine. And whatever your opinions on the conflict, whether you're Jewish or Arab or Israeli or Palestinian or no general direct connection to the matter, but have your opinions on it regardless, because it's a human rights issue. It's a whatever your opinions on it are. That's not what I'm trying to get into. This isn't a political discussion. The way that it was handled in this episode was almost the exact definition of what not to do. The way that the Doctor is portrayed in this episode, some people have seen this episode, and the way that the Doctor erupts in this episode as calling back to the 10th Doctor with the Time Lord Victorious and the darker side of the Doctor, right? We never see the darker side of Ncuti Gatwa's Doctor. It's nice to see in this episode. Sure. But the thing about the Time Lord Victorious arc is that it was something that was built up to. It was something that didn't just happen out of nowhere. This was something that had been slowly showing itself over 3 seasons of television and finally erupted because he could do it. In this episode, with zero emotional buildup, apart from the fact that the Doctor doesn't like the fact that several trillion people are about to die, all of a sudden, the Doctor starts beating the hell out of a genocide survivor. Granted, is acting as a terrorist, is doing something that is morally wrong from a just, a general standpoint. But the way that the Doctor handles the situation and the way that the Doctor justifies his actions in this episode, and then the way that the whole conflict is basically said, oh, it's all okay because a beautiful song was sung. You know what I mean? Like, it was handled so poorly that no wonder people are pissed about this episode. You know what I'm saying? Like, regardless of your opinions on either side of it, what we got was the bare bones of a centrist view on a very, very real problem in our actual world. And we were told not to worry about it because there's beauty in song. And then on top of that, then of course we get all of the stuff with, first of all, we get this, the Susan Foreman reveal. The Doctor's granddaughter just suddenly shows up. Sure. Okay, great. I want to backtrack to something about Wish World. We got a Rogue cameo. We'll talk about Rogue in a sec. That was weird. But we get a Susan Foreman cameo in this episode, which never goes anywhere. Susan just appears for like less than 10 seconds so that the Doctor can Princess Leia his way back to the Interstellar Song Contest arena. That doesn't go anywhere. Like, what was that about? And then they ruin the reveal of the Ronnie at the end of this episode to set up Wish World. And if we'd had that in Wish World, we maybe would have had a little more substance to the drop at the end of the episode. But we get it in the episode before. And with that, then, you get kind of this feeling that, oh my gosh, we got Susan, oh my gosh, we got the Ronnie, like this episode is so good because of the plot reveals. No, this episode was not good. You've been tricked into liking it because there's nostalgia baiting for something that you like. This episode is not good. From a writing standpoint, I will say that the reason it sits in C tier and not something like D tier or F tier is because of the fact that it looks beautiful, the music is fantastic in this episode, and the acting is great. The acting genuinely in this episode is fantastic. The way that they brought in Eurovision to this episode is fantastic. I love the way that they integrated everything into this episode. The story just sucks in execution. And they try to make you feel better about it because it's tricking your thoughts on nostalgia. So for me, it sits in basically the middle of C tier there. Let's jump up then to Joy to the World. Joy to the World is a weird one. Now, I'm fairly open on all of my channels about the fact that I am Christian. And I typically, I don't slight Doctor Who necessarily for its views on religion. And this episode was a weird one because you got people on both sides, the religious folk that were offended that Doctor Who was kind of rewriting biblical history, whatever. And then you got the non-religious crowd that was mad that Doctor Who even brought in religious mythology into the universe. I just thought it was kind of funny that all of a sudden you get to the end of this episode and she turns into a star and boom, it's the Star of Bethlehem. Like that, it's kind of weird. And like, I'll give you the religious standpoint. Like it doesn't change the story that I believe in, if that makes any sense. So it's kind of a weird inclusion. I thought it was a fun inclusion. But that being said, the episode around it is paced really weird. I like Nicola Coughlan for what she does in this episode. But many people before me have pointed out that, like, Anita is the star of this episode. Anita is the true companion of this episode. The Doctor's middle section is fantastic. The only problem with that being the middle section of this episode is that it feels very out of place compared to the first third and the final third. And so you kind of get two very different episodes, one of which is split in half by this other episode. And it just kind of is written really weird. Like, it just doesn't, the whole episode just kind of feels all over the place. And so I don't really know where else to put it. It's a fun romp, but it's a mess and it doesn't make any sense. And it, it was nice to have Doctor Who at Christmas, to bridge the gap between series 14 and 15. But otherwise, for me, it just kind of sits there. It's a good looking episode. I like the way this episode looks. I like the idea of the time hotel. C tier for me. Let's then move up to Rogue. Now, I want to preface this entry by saying that this episode was not written for someone like me. I am not the intended audience for this. That being said, as a critic of media in general, I thought the performances in this episode were very fun. I thought the cast was enjoyable. I'm not a fan of Bridgerton. I am not a fan necessarily of changed historical episodes. I didn't really feel the romance necessarily. Granted, I don't feel the romance that much at the beginning of something like The Girl in the Fireplace, which this episode feels kind of similar to in its atmosphere. But the story fits a lot better with the romance than this one does. This episode feels very weird. I'm not really sure why the Doctor would fall for Rogue, given everything that we know about the Doctor and his morals and everything. I liked the Kylie cameo. I liked that this episode made not Dimensions in Time. This episode made the Schalke Doctor canon. That was funny to me. Another inconsequential episode to me. I get why some people really, really like this episode. I don't think this is a very well-written episode. It was very obviously written by people who knew kind of the bare bones of Doctor Who, which has its positives and negatives, because obviously the bottom 3 episodes on this list were written or co-written by people who have watched this show since the 1970s. But it's just kind of inconsequential for me. And I mentioned, Rogue as a character, the performance is great, but Rogue as a character I don't really get. I don't understand the Doctor's attraction to him. I don't understand why it means so much for the Doctor in this episode, and especially the really odd cameo from Rogue that looks terrible on green screen in Wish World. That's another thing to diss Wish World that we forgot to talk about. It just looks really poor. The CGI and everything is terrible. Anyways, Rogue for me sits kind of top of C tier there. Let's then move up to B tier. And in B tier, at the bottom of B tier on our list at least, is going to sit, and I'm hoping I'm not skipping over anything, I think I'm going to put the Devil's Cord, bottom of B tier. Now, there's a lot to like about the Devil's Cord here. I thought the performance from Jinx Monsoon was fantastic. The just Maestro as a character is so much fun. To the point where every time the Doctor and Ruby were on screen, I was like, when is Maestro coming back? Please give me more Maestro. This episode is so much fun every time Maestro's on screen. The inclusion of the Beatles and the setting of this episode was disappointing. And the reason, obviously, being that they couldn't license Beatles music. In which case, I will voice... I think it's Verdana who had this very similar opinion, and it's an opinion that's been shared around the Doctor Who universe. Why make a Beatles episode if you're not going to use Beatles music, or if you can't use Beatles music? Why? Why do that? As a music fan and a music history fan, it was also really funny to me that the ending of this episode saw the Beatles playing a chord after they saw it written, which doesn't make any sense because the Beatles didn't know how to read music. It's fun to see them at Abbey Road. The musical number at the end, didn't need that, didn't care for that, didn't really care for the music battle. Didn't really get the motivations of any of the characters in this episode. If there's a reason it's this high, it's simply because Jinx Monsoon was so incredible in the performance of Maestro. This is some of the most fun I've ever had with a Doctor Who villain. But the rest of the episode is kind of just okay. It's there, But so bottom of B tier, I'm putting the Devil's Cord. Let's then move on to the Robot Revolution. And actually, yeah, I think I'm going to put the Robot Revolution just above, the more I think about it, the Devil's Cord. Robot Revolution's another one. Some people really don't like it. If you follow Who culture, like What Culture is Doctor Who channel, they really don't care for the Robot Revolution. And there's a lot about this episode that is inconsequential. It's definitely a start to Belinda Chandra's world and universe and just like her story in general. I thought it was fun. I thought the world building was fun. It's lighthearted. It feels to me very much like a Partners in Crime type episode, where it's another one of those that's inconsequential, but the comedy and especially in this episode, the way that it looks, I think this episode looks fantastic, especially when compared to something like Wish World. I thought just the humor in this episode was very fun. The story was very fun. Inconsequential, but a good start to Belinda's story. I think it firmly deserves to sit in B tier, especially upon rewatch. I didn't love it the first time I watched it, but on rewatch, I think this, for me, definitely sits in B tier now, and I will put it above The Devil's Cord. Then let's move up to Lux. Now, Lux is one a lot of people really, really liked. And there's a lot to like about Lux, and I want to defend my position here first by saying that the performance by Alan Cumming of Lux, the character, or Mr. Ring-a-Ding, is great. The music in this episode is great. The performances in this episode are great. The visuals of this episode are great. Even the story, to a certain extent, when we're talking specifically about Mr. Ring-a-Ding and Lux, is good. But much like Joy to the World, this episode suffers from its pacing and the way that the story is constructed and developed. Specifically, and I liked the meta joke. I really do like the meta joke of them coming out of the TV into a fandom of Doctor Who. Like, that is very funny to me. And I enjoyed it, and I enjoyed the performances of the characters in that part of the episode. But the pacing of that in the midst of this episode was very messy. I didn't like the way that it was done. I didn't like the whole meta, them traveling through to me that didn't make any sense. Even them trapped in a cartoon made sense to me, but them traveling through the television to break free didn't make, I don't know how to explain it better than the fact that I just thought the pacing of this and the progression of the story didn't make any sense to me. I did think the way that they ended up defeating Lux was clever. I liked the setting. I really liked the setting of this episode, and I liked the visuals, but the progression of the story and the pacing is really poor. And so for me, that's why it sits in B tier. Let's then move up as we go up on our list to, I have it top of B tier, and I'm tempted to put it in A tier. I think for one specific reason, it's going to stay in B tier. The story and the engine, let's talk about all the really, really good things. I love the setting. We get Doctor Who in Africa, which has really never been done before. We get just kind of this view into black history and black culture that, I'm not the person to speak on it, but as a white person watching this, I thought it was a very interesting historical introspection into something that I really didn't know much about, or anything about, rather, especially when you're talking about hairstyles and the history of cornrows and things like that. I thought the visuals in this episode with the wall mural, I thought that was fantastic. I loved the characters, even the side characters in this episode. I thought as little as some of them were developed, I thought they all played their own parts in this episode. What I didn't really like or get about this episode, I liked the villain, but I didn't quite understand what was the spider, what was the engine, why were they doing what they were doing, apart from revenge against the gods. Like, there were certain parts of the story where when you poke it with a needle, the air starts to rush out a little bit. But it's all kind of surrounded in this really, really beautiful world building and look into the Doctor's existence presently as a black man. And then they touch on kind of the history as a black woman. We see the Fugitive Doctor, a very interesting cameo that I thought was fantastic. I love every time we get to see the Fugitive Doctor. a weak, hole-poking story surrounded by very, very, very well-done production, storytelling, world-building, that sort of thing, if that makes any sense. I'm kind of jumbling my words when I say storytelling, but I thought just kind of the root basis for the motivations was a little poor, but everything else was very good. For me, it's very, very top of B tier. Almost tempted to put it bottom of A tier, but for now it's going to sit top of B tier, rather. Let's then go to Baboom. Now, Baboom, the first time we've seen Stephen Moffat since Peter Capaldi's era. It was very nice to see him back. There's a lot to like about this episode. It looks very, very good. There's also a lot to question or dislike about this episode. And obviously, like I mentioned before, I'm coming at this from a religious kind of perspective. But even without that, it feels very, very weird the way the Doctor pokes holes in faith. Just not even religious faith, but just faith as a concept. Especially the way that this episode concludes, because we have the girl who has faith in her father, and the father's faith in love, which saves them at the end. And so the fact that the Doctor is so willing to just demolish faith as a concept, when the Doctor himself has faith in a lot of things, that it doesn't make a lot of sense. The Doctor's stance on faith in this episode, to me. But that being said, for having basically one set, this episode looks fantastic. The acting in this episode is great. Ncuti Gatwa was fantastic. This is probably the best Susan Triad or Susan Twist cameo that we get, in my opinion, in the whole series. We get the cool kind of pre-introduction to Verita Sethu as a companion, kind of, not really. It's a very good episode. There are a couple things that I don't like about it, and for me, that's why it's not the top of all of Ncuti Gatwa's episodes. It's very good. It looks very good. It's acted very well. The music's great. The emotional beats are great. I just think there, like I said with the story in the engine, where you can kind of pick holes in the story, I think that exists here too. Not quite to the extent that I feel in the story in the engine, but to an extent that it bothers me and distracts me from keeping it at the very, very, very top. So I'm going to have you guys imagine that Dot and Bubble exists right between those episodes there. Dot and Bubble is a fantastic episode. The atmosphere is weird, and I understand why some people don't like it, especially the fact that the Doctor and Ruby really aren't in it until the very end. But the world building that is done in what is otherwise and has been described as Doctor Who doing a Black Mirror episode, I think is done in such a way that is so subtle and so well written that by the end, when we get the plot twist that they're not just classist, egotistical Nepo babies, they are genuinely racist people. It's done in such a way and is so well acted, not just by Ncuti Gatwa, but by the entire cast, that when you watch it back and you see all the little microaggressions and all the little intricacies of the character dynamics going on, it just paints everything in a whole new light that you never saw before. And that in itself is a meta context on just race in general and the way that we perceive race and how we can re-look at the way that we act and the things that we do and how that shows our prejudices, if that makes any sense. I've probably said things in this episode itself that hint at little things that I don't even realize I'm doing. And that's just because of the way that I grew up, the culture that I grew up in, the exposure that I have to certain cultures and things like that. And this is twisted on its head in a way that is so dark and so twisted. But it's handled so perfectly that when we get that final reveal and you go back and watch it, it's not a perfect episode. There are issues with it. But it is so well orchestrated the pacing of this episode is done in such a way that it is, if I liked the atmosphere a little bit better, like the atmosphere of this episode is very, very well crafted. If I liked it just a little bit more, I think I'd put this episode higher. But the character beats and the pacing of the writing is done so well that I think it firmly deserves to sit up in A tier. Next, let's move up to 73 yards. Yeah, I really am putting The Well at number 1. 73 yards is a fantastic episode. Now, we talked earlier, I kind of hinted at the fact that we have 2 Dr. Light episodes here, both centering around Ruby and kind of her day-to-day life. We have Lucky Day in D tier. We have this one up in A tier. In 73 yards, what I like about 73 yards is it's a mystery that never gives away the mystery. But at the same time, and this is the important part, even though it doesn't give away the mystery, it makes sense in the context of everything going on, or at least it feels somewhat like a coherent story or a coherent mystery. And what I mean by that specifically is when we get to the end of the episode and Ruby dies and is transported back in time to become the old woman, it's kind of this closed loop that then gets set aside at the end because the old woman stops Ruby from, or stops the Doctor from stepping on the fairy circle, which then means all of the events of the episode don't happen, which means that this kind of bootstrap paradox is reset and flipped, and it doesn't really make sense. But at the same time, the way that the episode handles it, especially atmospherically, is it leaves it open-ended. We're not really sure what Ruby remembers or what she doesn't remember, and it kind of sits in the back of her head. And we even, with the most recent episode, with the reality war, we kind of get this sense that Ruby's memories are something that do exist like that. Like Ruby's whole universe is always memories that exist or don't exist in the back of her mind, which is kind of an interesting thought looking back retrospectively. But what I really like about 73 Yards is it's this kind of ambiguous closed circuit world. There isn't really an answer to the mystery, but at the same time, the way that the story handles the mystery is done in a way that I think is really, really satisfying. I like that the Doctor isn't in this. I like that Ruby has to figure things out. There's fun pokes at Wales and the view of Welsh culture in general. I like that we never know what is being said about Ruby. I like that Ruby is on her own and has to kind of exist in this world and figure things out on her own. And the way that Ruby saves the day at the end is really, really well handled and well done, I thought. Robert F. Williams is an interesting character. I wish we would have fleshed out that story a little more. I think there's 2 sides of this episode that at times feel like they don't necessarily mesh that well together. But like I said, the way that the story handles its elements, I think, is done in a way and an atmosphere that is really, really, really solid. And for me, that's why it sits where it does in A tier. And then we have The Well. So for me, The Well is easily the best Doctor Who episode in Ncuti Gatwa's era. To me, it's not quite an S tier. It's almost there, but it sits top of A tier. I think the way that it handles a monster previously, that we never really had to see again, was done in such a way that doesn't detract from the previous episode, but at the same time also doesn't distract during this episode. If I have any issues with this, to keep it out of the S tier spot, I think it relies a little too much on the visual flashbacks. I think you could have told this story without spoon-feeding it to us what this creature was or where it came from. All of us fans of Midnight would have known what this planet was, what this episode was, but you didn't have to show us the 10th Doctor fighting the monster. You know what I mean? And to anyone else who has never seen that, they'd be less distracted by those cutaways. I like the way that the ending of this episode leaves it a little ambiguous, Did the monster escape? Were there two monsters? What happened? How did this ending of the episode happen? I like the emotional beats. I thought the all of the supporting cast was acted in a way that was fantastic. The way that it handles sign language, the way that it handles hearing impairments is fantastic. As I can't speak for total hearing impairedness, but as someone who struggles with hearing, like, it was cool to see this in this episode. It was very, very cool to see. I really liked the acting. I really liked the storytelling. I liked the atmosphere of the episode, given, like we talked about with Boom in the previous series. This is basically one or two sets. It's a very small scale episode that feels so big because of the way that it's filmed, the way that it is choreographed, the way that everything goes on. I thought it was very, very well done. There are a few things I don't like about the way that we don't quite understand that it tries to add rules to a villain that didn't have rules before, and the rules are done in a way that still don't quite make sense. And one could argue that it's to keep things still ambiguous and ambivalent, but I don't quite love that. But regardless, I thought that this episode was fantastic. I thought it followed up Midnight very well. Midnight didn't need a sequel, but I think it, for what it is fantastic, is very, very well done. The acting's fantastic. I really like this episode. I think in Ncuti Gatwa's entire era, it doesn't get much better than A tier for The Well. So with that being said, please ignore the fact that Dot and Bubble is missing, but if we count the 8 episodes in one, 8 episodes in the other, one Christmas special because we've already ranked the other Christmas special in consideration, for seasons 14 and 15 with the single Christmas special in between, 17 episodes. In last place, number 17, we have Wish World. Number 16 up in D tier, we have The Reality War. 15 in D tier, we have Lucky Day. We move up to C tier, number 14, Space Babies. 13, Empire of Death. 12, Legend of Ruby Sunday. 11, The Interstellar Song Contest. 10, Joy to the World. 9, Rogue. That is top of C tier. We move up to B tier with number 8. That is The Devil's Chord. 7, we have The Robot Revolution. 6, Lux. 5, top of B tier, we have The Story and the Engine. Move up to A tier. In 4th place, we have Boom. 3rd place, missing there, is Dot and Bubble. 2nd place, we have 73 Yards. And in 1st place, also in A tier, the best episode, I believe, in Ncuti Gatwa's era is The Well. So let me know what you thought of Ncuti Gatwa's entire era in the comment section below. I'd love to see your rankings of all of these episodes. Check out plenty of other Doctor Who content on this channel, but I'd like to give some shoutouts to other channels as well. Some that I've already shouted out in this video. Verdana, of course, DW Fan 91. I did say Who Culture if you guys want to check out Who Culture. Harbo Worms is a fantastic channel to check out Doctor Who content, as is Theres. Theres, who appeared in Wish World. Want to give Thomas a shout out there. Fantastic channel as well. So go check out all of those if you haven't already. And if there's other stuff that you're interested in and want to check out on the channel, feel free to do so. Otherwise, like, share, subscribe, and we'll see you back here hopefully very, very soon.